A woman drags a body, through snow up to her hips. Behind her, blood leaves a long red seam across all, that white, and buried in the stranger's ribs is the broken shaft of an arrow. She doesn't know who he is. 50 yards. That's all it is, 50 yards from the treeline to her door. Every step, her lungs burn. Every step, something sensible inside her screams at her to let go. She doesn't let go. There is a small knife tucked into the stranger's belt. She hasn't seen it yet. But soon, when the firelight catches that worn smooth handle, she will know it instantly. Because it belonged to her husband. And her husband has been under 3 winters of frozen ground. Far up on the ridge, the snow begins to tremble. That isn't wind. Hooves. A great many of them. And they are coming down. What the snow buried. 5 riders on the ridge. Then 10. Then more coming out of the treeline like the mountain itself was spitting them out. Maren Calloway stood in her doorway, with a rifle she hadn't fired in a year, and watched them come. Watched the horses picking, through drifts up to their bellies. Watched the sun catch on rifle barrels, and lance points, and the dark shapes of men, who had every reason in the world to burn her cabin to the ground. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold. She thought, this is it. This is where it ends. 5 years alone in these mountains, and it ends, because I couldn't leave a dying man in the snow. Except that wasn't quite true either. Because leaving him would have ended something too. Just a slower kind of ending. The kind that happens in a woman's chest, quietly, over years, until one day she wakes up, and doesn't recognize the person in the wash basin water anymore. So. Here she was. 5 days earlier, none of this existed. 5 days earlier there was only the mountain, and the wind, and a silence, so complete it had a texture to it, like wool. Let's go back there. The cabin sat, where the pines gave way to open rock, high enough in the Chiricahuas, that the air stayed thin, and sharp even in August. Josiah had picked the spot. Said a man could see trouble coming, from up here. Said that like it was a comfort. It wasn't trouble, that took him in the end. It was his lungs. 3 winters ago now. A cough that started small, and polite, like it was embarrassed to be there, and grew until it filled the cabin at night, filled it the way water fills a boot. She'd nursed him through 2 winters of it. Buried him at the start of the 3rd. 5 years total she'd lived up here. 3 of them alone. People in Tucson thought she was mad. Said it to her face, some of them, the ones bold enough, or drunk enough. A woman, alone, in Apache country, with the whole territory on fire, with raids and reprisals, and men on both sides burying their dead. They said it like they expected her to flinch. She didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching a long time before that. Because here was the thing nobody in Tucson understood. She wasn't reckless. She was careful. Careful in a way that had kept her alive, when carelessness would have gotten her killed twice over. She knew which trails were watched, and which weren't. Knew not to hunt past the ridge line to the east, not because anyone had told her to stop, but because Josiah had explained it to her once, quietly, over coffee, in the voice he used for things that mattered. That's Chiricahua land past there, Maren. Not ours. We're guests here. Best we act like it. She'd asked him how he knew that. He'd gotten quiet. Changed the subject. She hadn't pressed. Should have pressed. She knew that now. Too late for it to matter, probably. But she knew it. The blizzard came in on the 2nd Tuesday of January, and it came in wrong. Not gradual. Not a build-up of gray clouds, and a dropping thermometer, the kind of storm a body could see coming, and prepare for. This one arrived like a slap. 1 hour the sky was hard blue and empty. The next, a wall of white came down off the peak, so fast the chickens didn't even make it to the coop. She got them in anyway. Fought the wind the last 20 feet, fingers already going numb, through her mittens, and slammed the door behind her, and stood there gasping like she'd run a mile instead of crossed a yard. 2 days. The storm held for 2 days. She had food. Had wood stacked to the rafters, because she always stacked wood to the rafters, because that was the first lesson the mountain taught anyone stupid enough to winter in it alone. Had dried meat, and flour, and a cellar of preserved things. Wasn't worried about herself. Worried about everything else, though. The deer she'd see some mornings at the treeline. The hawk that nested in the rock face above the spring. Worried in that useless, aching way a person worries about things they can't do anything about, lying awake listening to wine try to tear the roof off. Until the second night, when the wind stopped screaming, and started something worse. A low moan. Steady. Almost like breathing. She lay in the dark, and listened to it, and thought about Josiah's voice, and how she still heard it sometimes, usually right at the edge of sleep, usually saying something practical. Check the flue, Maren. Bank the fire before you turn in. She missed the practical things most. Funny, that. Not the big declarations. The practical things. Which was its own kind of loneliness. The kind nobody warns a widow about. Not the missing of grand gestures, but the missing of someone who'd remind you to check the flue. She got up. Check the flue. Morning of the third day, the wind finally let go. Not all at once. It eased down slow, like a hand loosening its grip one finger at a time, until what was left was a hush, so total it felt like the world was holding its breath along with her. She scraped a circle clear on the frosted window glass, and looked out at a landscape she barely recognized. Everything soft. Everything rounded off. The woodpile a smooth white loaf. The fence posts capped like candles. Snow still coming down, but gentle now, drifting, almost lazy about it. Beautiful, she thought. And then, right behind that thought, unbidden, dangerous. Because beautiful and dangerous were the same thing up here half the time. She'd learned that too. She was reaching for the coffee pot, when she saw it. A shape at the tree line. Dark against all that white. Her first thought was branch. Storm brought branches down all the time, heavy ones, snapped clean off by the weight of ice. She almost turned back to the stove. Except the shape was wrong for a branch. Too straight in some places. Too curved in others. And there was something about the way it lay there, something her eyes understood, before her mind caught up, some old animal part of her brain, that had kept her alive this long standing straight up and shouting. That's a man. She didn't move for a full 10 seconds. Just stood at the window, with her hand still on the coffee pot handle, cold coffee pot, cold hand, both of them forgotten. Because if that was a man, out there, in Apache country, 5 days after a war party had been sighted near Fort Bowie according to the last writer, if that was a man, then whoever he was, however he'd gotten there, this was not a simple thing. This was not a thing she could solve, with a blanket, and a cup of broth, and a clear conscience. This was a decision. And decisions up here had teeth. She thought about bolting the door. Actually thought it, clear as a spoken sentence in her own head. Bolt the door. Don't look again. Whatever's out there, it's not your business, it's not your trouble, you have survived 5 years up here by minding exactly what's yours, and nothing more. Except she was already reaching for her coat. Later she'd try to explain it to herself, and fail every time. Why she went. Why some women would have bolted that door and never thought twice, and she couldn't. She wasn't a saint. She wasn't fearless. Her stomach had turned to ice water the second she understood what she was looking at, and it stayed that way the whole walk out. But there was Josiah's voice again. Not a ghost. Nothing so dramatic as that. Just memory, doing what memory does, surfacing at the exact moment she needed it. Every soul's worth saving, Maren. If you've got the means. He used to say it about everything. Wounded animals. Drifters passing through, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. He'd have gone out, into that snow, without a second thought, and she knew it, and some stubborn part of her refused to be less than the man she'd married. So she pulled on her thickest mittens. Wrapped a scarf twice around her throat. And she took Josiah's old rifle down off its pegs above the hearth, not because she meant to use it on a dying man, but because she had no idea what else might be out there, with him, and a woman alone learns fast, that hope is not a strategy. The snow outside was worse than it looked, from the window. Hip-deep in the drifts. Every step a small negotiation, with her own exhausted lungs. By the time she'd covered 30 yards she was breathing like she'd run from something. Which, in a way, she had. She was running, from every sensible instinct she owned. She got close enough to see clearly, and what she saw made her stop dead. A man. Not white. Not a trapper. Not one of the drifters, who sometimes came, through looking for work or trouble. His clothing told her, that before his face did. Fringed leggings, dark with frozen blood in places. A hide shirt stiff as bark. No horse anywhere. No tracks leading to him, that hadn't already been erased by 2 days of storm, which meant he'd been lying there, since before the blizzard even broke, which meant he should already be dead. She knelt beside him. Pulled off one mitten with her teeth, because her fingers needed to feel this, needed to know for certain, and pressed 2 fingers against the side of his throat. There. Faint. So faint it was less a pulse than the memory of one. A moth's wing beat against her fingertips. Alive. Barely. But alive. His face was young. That struck her hardest, harder than the blood, harder than the cold. Young, and even slack, with unconsciousness there was something proud in the set of his jaw, something that didn't belong to a man who'd simply gotten lost and frozen. There was a scar, through one eyebrow, old, healed pale. And there, half buried under him, twisted at an angle, that made her stomach drop, the broken shaft of an arrow. Not the storm, then. Not just the cold. Someone had put an arrow in him, and left him to die in a blizzard. She didn't remember deciding to move him. Only remembered the doing of it. The awful weight of him, dead weight, frozen weight, nothing like lifting a sleeping child, nothing like anything she'd lifted before. She tried carrying and failed. Tried dragging and nearly failed at that too, until she thought to loop her own shawl under his shoulders like a sling, and lean her whole body into it, one furious inch at a time. 50 yards. That was all it was. 50 yards from the treeline to her door. It took forever. It took every ounce of strength she'd built up, over 5 years of hauling wood, and hauling water, and hauling herself out of a grief, that could have flattened her, if she'd let it. Her lungs burned. Her arms screamed. Somewhere around the 20-yard mark she stopped thinking in words at all, and just moved, animal and desperate, one step, then another, then another. Get him inside. That was the whole of her thinking. Get him inside, or he dies, and you watched it happen, and you'll carry that the rest of your life the way you carry everything else. She got the door open with her hip. Dragged him over the threshold, onto the rag rug in front of the hearth, and collapsed beside him, gasping, her vision sparking at the edges. The fire had burned to embers, while she was gone. Of course it had. Of course the one time she needed it roaring it had gone, and died down to nothing. She didn't let herself rest. Couldn't. She crawled to the hearth on hands and knees and fed it kindling, with fingers that had gone, from numb to burning to numb again, and coaxed a flame up out of almost nothing, the way she'd learned to do 100 times before, except her hands were shaking now for a different reason than cold. Only when the fire caught properly, only when heat started pushing back against the chill of the room, did she turn to look at him fully. And go still. Because he had not moved. Not once. Not a twitch, not a breath she could see. For one long, terrible second she thought, I dragged a dead man 50 yards, through snow for nothing, and something in her chest cracked at the thought of it, cracked clean through. Then his chest rose. Just barely. A shallow, ragged breath that she felt more than saw. Alive. Still alive. Okay, she told herself. Okay. Then get to work. Getting him out of his frozen clothes felt like a violation, before it felt like anything else. She hesitated at first, hand hovering over the ties at his shoulder, some old propriety rearing up even now, even with a man's life bleeding out on her floor. A stranger. A man from a people the newspapers called savages, and her own people called enemies half the time, though she'd never once believed that, not really, not since Josiah. But hesitation was a luxury. She didn't have it to spend. She used Josiah's hunting knife, careful, cutting the frozen thongs rather than tearing them, because something in her understood, even in the panic of the moment, that this clothing meant something to him. Beadwork. Fine stitching. Someone had made this, with care, for someone they loved. Which was its own small ache, tucked inside the larger one. The shirt came away in pieces. And that was, when her hand brushed against something at his belt. Small. Hard. Tucked into a leather sheath she almost cut straight, through without noticing. A knife. Not his fighting knife, that one was still strapped to his other hip, a longer blade, with a worn bone handle. This one was smaller. Different. And when it slid free of its sheath, and caught the firelight, Maren Calloway forgot, for one full second, how to breathe. Because she knew that knife. She'd seen it 100 times. Watched Josiah clean fish with it. Watched him whittle with it on quiet evenings, shavings curling onto the floor, while he hummed some tune he never finished. She knew the handle, worn smooth in exactly that place, worn by exactly that kind of grip. She knew the small mark scratched into the base of the blade, a mark Josiah always covered, with his thumb like it embarrassed him, like it was a secret he'd rather not explain. She'd asked him once where he got it. He'd said, a friend gave it to me, Maren. Long time ago. Left it at that. She'd thought it was gone. Sold, maybe, or lost somewhere on one of his trips, into town, back before she knew to ask more questions, back before she understood, that the quiet parts of a marriage are sometimes the parts that matter most. And now here it was. In the belt of a dying Apache warrior. On her floor. In the firelight. Her hands had gone very still. What in God's name, she thought. What in God's name did you not tell me, Josiah? She set the knife down on the mantel, with the kind of care a person uses for something that might shatter. It wouldn't shatter. It was a knife. But her hands didn't seem to know that. Later, she told herself. Ask him later. If there is a later. There was the wound to deal with first. There was always the wound. She peeled back the last of the frozen hide shirt, and found it, the broken shaft, snapped off close to the skin, buried in the meat of his side just below the ribs. The surrounding flesh was swollen dark, the blood around it frozen, into something like black glass. She'd stitched wounds before. Set a broken arm once, for a trapper who'd fallen off his own roof, of all things. She knew fevers, knew how to bring one down, knew which plants did what, and which did nothing, but comfort a frightened patient, into thinking they did something. An arrowhead lodged near the ribs was past all of that. Past everything she actually knew how to do. Leave it in, and infection would take him slow, over days, in a way, that would be its own kind of cruelty to watch. Pull it out wrong, and he could bleed out on her floor in minutes. She didn't have a good option. She only had the least bad one. Not tonight, though. Tonight, warming him mattered more. She piled every blanket she owned over his shaking frame, Josiah's old quilt on top, and she heated water, and worked his hands and feet with soft rags, coaxing blood back into fingers gone the color of ash. He groaned once. A low sound, more animal than human, and his eyes fluttered without opening. Words came out of him. Broken. Slurred. A language she didn't understand, not one word of it, and yet something in the shape of the sounds carried its own meaning anyway. Fear. Or warning. Or both. Easy, she whispered, mostly to steady her own nerves. You're safe. For now. For now. She heard herself say it, and understood, with a cold little twist in her stomach, that she meant it, as a real qualifier. Not a comfort. A fact. Because somewhere out there, in the vast white silence beyond her walls, was whoever had put that arrow in him. And they hadn't finished the job. Which meant they might still be looking. Which meant for now might be all any of them had. The first night passed in fragments. She dozed sitting upright by the hearth, jerking awake every time his breathing changed, every time the fire popped too loud, every time the wind found a new gap in the chinking to whistle through. Around midnight she made a poultice of yarrow, ground fine, pressed it around the wound, as best she could, without disturbing the buried arrowhead, and bound it, with strips torn, from an old petticoat she'd been meaning to turn, into rags anyway. Small mercies. She counted them where she found them. By the gray hour, before dawn, his fever had started to climb. She could feel it radiating off him, before she even touched his forehead, a heat that seemed wrong against skin, that had been near frozen only hours before, like his body had swung, from one extreme straight past anything reasonable, into the other. She bathed his face with cool water. Spooned warm broth between cracked lips whenever he surfaced enough to swallow. Talked to him, low and steady, though she doubted a word of it landed anywhere he could understand. You're going to be all right, she told him. Because somebody should say it. Even if it isn't true yet. Second day. The storm outside had gone fully quiet, snow no longer falling, just lying there, thick and white, and indifferent to everything happening beneath her roof. She used the lull to examine the wound more closely in better light, and that was, when she noticed something, that snagged her attention the same way the knife had. The arrowhead. What little she could see of it around the broken shaft. She'd seen arrowheads before. Traders sometimes brought them through, curiosities to sell to Easterners hungry for souvenirs of a frontier they'd never actually risk visiting. Different peoples worked stone and flint differently. Style. Habit. A kind of signature. This one didn't sit right in her memory of any of them. Too small. Too smooth. No decoration. No care in the shaping beyond what was needed to kill. She sat back on her heels, and looked at it a long moment, and a thought slid into her mind, cold and unwelcome, and would not slide back out again. That doesn't look like a war arrow. That looks like a bounty arrow. She'd heard the term before. Overheard it, more accurately, in Tucson, in the low voices of men, who didn't know a woman was listening, or didn't care, if she was. Men who got paid, by the territory, by mining companies hungry for land, by God knew, who else, for confirmed Apache deaths, whatever grim proof would satisfy whoever was paying. Which meant, if she was right. Which meant this young man on her floor hadn't been caught in some skirmish between rival bands, hadn't fallen in a fight between warriors, who at least understood, and respected each other as enemies. He'd been hunted. For money. By people who saw him, as a line item. She looked down at him. At the knife on the mantel, that had once belonged to her husband. At the wound in his side, that told a story she was only beginning to understand the shape of. 3 days, she thought. If his people are looking for him, and surely they are, surely a man like this has people who'd search, they'll come. Sooner or later, they'll come. And when they do, she thought, and felt the cold settle deep, into her chest, deeper than any winter had ever managed. When they do, they are going to want to know exactly what happened to him. And I am going to have an answer. Outside, the wind picked up again, faint and low, like something out there had only been resting, and was getting ready to move. The arrow comes out. 3rd day. Sun so bright on new snow it hurt to look at, like the whole world had been polished overnight, and forgot to ask, if anyone wanted it that way. Maren stood over the young man on her floor, and understood, with a kind of dread, that sat low, and heavy in her stomach, that today was the day. Not tomorrow. Not when she felt ready, because she would never feel ready, not for this. Today. Because his fever hadn't broken. Because the skin around the wound had gone the color of a bruised plum, dark and tight, and hot to the touch. Because infection didn't wait for a woman to work up her courage. It just came, quiet and patient, and took what it wanted, while she hesitated. So. No more hesitating. She built the fire up, until the cabin felt like the inside of an oven. Boiled water until the windows fogged. Laid out her cleanest rags, Josiah's sharpest knife, sterilized now, held in the flame, until the blade glowed faint blue at the edge, and the small dark bundle of yarrow she'd been saving. And she looked at him. Really looked, the way you look at something right, before you do it damage in order to save it. I am going to try, and take it out now, she told him. Speaking slow. Speaking clear. As if clarity could cross a language she didn't have any words in. He didn't answer. Couldn't. But his eyes opened anyway, dark and glassy, with fever, and found her face, and held there. He understood. Somehow, without a single shared word, he understood exactly what she meant to do. He gave one slow blink. Like a man bracing. Hold still, she whispered. Though he was already, so still it frightened her. This is going to hurt. Understatement of her whole life, probably. She almost laughed at herself for saying it. Didn't, though. Nothing about that moment had room for laughing. Her hands weren't steady. She'd like to say they were, later, if she ever told this story to anyone, which she doubted she would. But the truth was her hands shook the whole time, shook even as she positioned the blade alongside the broken shaft, shook even as she took the breath she needed to actually begin. Because this wasn't setting a bone. Wasn't stitching a cut across a trapper's forearm. This was a live thing buried against a rib, close enough to something vital, that one wrong angle could undo every hour she'd already spent keeping him alive. Steady, Maren, she told herself. And heard it in Josiah's voice instead of her own, which was strange, and which she didn't have time to examine. She widened the entry point first, gentle as she knew how, feeling for the edges of the arrowhead, through torn muscle, and swollen tissue. Found the hard resistance of bone beneath it, a rib. The arrow had wedged itself right up against a rib, and understood, in a cold clear flash, that this was exactly the kind of thing that could go wrong in about 4 different ways. He gritted his teeth. A hiss escaped him, low, involuntary. Sweat beading on a face otherwise still pale with cold. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because stopping now, halfway, was worse than either finishing, or never having started at all. She angled the blade downward, the way she'd guessed it needed to go, feeling more than seeing, working by touch in a wound, that gave her nothing back except resistance, and heat and the wet give of flesh, that had already suffered too much. Then. All at once. The arrowhead shifted. And she pulled. The sound he made didn't belong in a small cabin. Didn't belong anywhere gentle. A roar, raw and sudden, tearing up out of him like something that had been held down for days, and finally broke free, his back arching off the rug, hands clenching into fists, knuckles white against the furs beneath him. Maren stumbled back. The broken shaft was in her hand. Small. Dark. Unbarbed, she registered dimly. Small mercy. Except there wasn't time to feel grateful for it. Because blood came after. Dark, welling fast, so much more than she'd braced for, soaking into the rag rug beneath him in a spreading stain, that made her stomach lurch straight up, into her throat. Oh God! Oh God, what have I done? No. Stop. Move. She scrambled for the yarrow poultice, hands clumsy with panic now instead of hesitation, and pressed it hard against the wound, both palms, every ounce of weight she had. He groaned. Trembled. Went slack beneath her hands, all at once, like a puppet, with the strings cut. Fainted. Or worse. Which, she wouldn't let herself finish that thought. Refused it outright. Pressed harder instead, watching the dark stain spread, and spread, and slow, an eternity measured out in heartbeats, hers hammering so loud in her own ears she couldn't have heard a rider approach the cabin, if one had ridden straight up to the door. Minutes. It was only minutes. Felt like the whole of that long winter compressed down into the space between one breath and the next. And then, slowly, agonizingly, the bleeding eased. She sat back on her heels, hands shaking, red to the wrist, and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, since the moment she'd first seen him lying in the snow 3 days before. Alive. Still. She glanced once at the arrowhead lying beside her on the floorboards, the same cheap unmarked stone she'd already puzzled over, and set it on the mantel next to the knife, without another word wasted on it. 2 small, quiet pieces of evidence, sitting side by side in the firelight, waiting for her to be ready to understand what they meant together. Not yet, though. Not today. Today had already asked enough of her. He drifted for the rest of that day between sleep and something worse than sleep. Fever climbed again toward evening, the way fevers do, like they save their cruelest hours for, when the light is failing, and a person's own strength is at its lowest ebb. She kept willow bark tea going. Kept cool rags on his forehead, changed and changed again. Kept talking to him, low, steady, mostly nonsense, mostly just the sound of a human voice in a room that had held nothing but her own thoughts for 3 long years. You're going to make it, she told him. I didn't do all that just to lose you now. Half a joke. Half a plea. He didn't hear either half of it, not really, lost somewhere down in the fever, but she said it anyway, because saying it out loud made it feel a little more true. And then, near midnight, he started talking back. Not to her. Not really. His eyes were open, but unseeing, fixed on some middle distance, that wasn't the cabin ceiling at all, and words came pouring out of him in a language she didn't understand one syllable of, urgent, pleading, frightened in a way that didn't match the stone-still face she'd first found in the snow. She caught only one thing. One single sound, repeated, over and over, threaded through everything else he said like a stitch holding a wound closed. Chody. A name. Had to be a name. He said it the way a person says a name they're terrified for, not a warrior's name, not a battle cry, something smaller than that, something that made her chest ache to hear even, without understanding a single other word around it. Chody. Chody. He kept circling back to it, urgent, and once, just once, his hand shot out, and closed around her wrist, with a strength she wouldn't have believed a man this weak still had, and he said it directly to her face, eyes still glassy, still not truly seeing her, but pleading all the same. Chody. She didn't know what it meant. Couldn't know. But something cold slid down, through her all the same, some instinct that had kept her alive alone on this mountain for 3 years telling her, plain as day, somebody else is out there. Somebody he's terrified for. And whatever happened to him in that ambush, it didn't happen to him alone. She held his hand until his grip loosened. Until his breathing evened out, into something closer to real sleep. "Chody," she whispered to the empty room, testing the shape of the word. "Whoever you are. I hope to God you're safe." The next 2 days passed in a rhythm that started to feel, strangely, almost peaceful. Almost. Fever, tea, cool rags, broth. Fever breaking a little, then climbing again, then breaking a little more, each cycle slightly less severe than the one before it, like a storm finally spending itself out. She slept in snatches by the hearth. Woke at every change in his breathing. Watched color creep slowly back, into a face that had been ash-gray when she first touched it in the snow. He was awake more, too, by the second full day. Not talking, not in any words she understood, and she'd stopped expecting that, but awake. Watching her. Following her movements around the small cabin, with dark eyes that had lost their fever glaze, and gained, instead, something sharper. Something assessing. She caught him once looking at the knife on the mantel. His knife. Josiah's knife. Whatever it truly was. His jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough that she noticed. "You know this knife," she said, more to herself than to him, because she knew he couldn't follow the words. She pointed to it anyway. Then touched her own chest. "My husband." She didn't have a gesture for the rest of the thought, the questions crowding up behind her teeth. Where did he get it? What did you know about him? What didn't he tell me? So she let it sit there unfinished, the way so many things about Josiah had sat unfinished, since the day she buried him. Taji, she didn't know his name yet, not truly, wouldn't for a little, while longer, watched her, with an expression she couldn't read. Something complicated. Something that might have been recognition, or might have been simple exhaustion misread as meaning. He said something low. A handful of words, quiet, almost to himself. She didn't understand them. But she filed the sound of them away, the same patient instinct that had already flagged a knife, and an arrowhead, assembling a puzzle she didn't yet have all the pieces to. It was on the evening of the 5th day, since the storm, the 3rd, since she'd pulled him inside her cabin, though it felt like a month compressed into 3 days, that the silence broke. She was stirring rabbit stew, the ordinary domestic motion of it almost soothing, after everything, when the sound reached her. Not wind. Not a branch giving way under snow load. Something rhythmic. Something with intention behind it. Hoofbeats. Muffled by snow, but unmistakable once her ear caught the pattern. And not one horse. Many. Her whole body went cold in an instant, colder than the blizzard itself had ever managed, because some animal part of her already knew exactly what this was, before her mind caught up to name it. They found him. Of course they found him. Of course they did. She dropped the ladle. Rushed to the window, scraped a fresh patch clear, with fingernails gone stiff, from the sudden fear, and looked out at a line of riders emerging, from the treeline like the mountain had been holding them in reserve the whole time, waiting for exactly this moment. A dozen, at least. Maybe more. Dark shapes against the snow, moving with a controlled, silent purpose that was somehow more frightening than, if they'd come screaming. They weren't riding past. They were riding straight for her cabin. Behind her, on the floor, Taji stirred. His eyes opened, found the sound, found her face, and something crossed his features, that she could read perfectly clear even across the language between them. Recognition. Relief. And underneath both of those, fear. Fear for her, specifically, which was a strange thing to see on the face of a man, whose own people were riding to his rescue. He tried to sit up. Winced hard, one hand going to the bound wound at his side, and managed only a few words, rasped out through obvious pain. She didn't understand the words. But she understood the tone. A warning. Stay down, she told him, voice not quite steady. You're too weak to be standing for anybody. The hoofbeats grew louder. Closer. And then, cutting through the cold evening air, a single sharp cry, a call, deliberate, meant to be heard, answered a moment later by others, scattered, coming from more than one direction now. They were surrounding the cabin. She thought of the rifle by the door. Thought of what one rifle would mean against however many riders were closing in around her small home. Thought, with a strange detached clarity, that she had survived 3 years alone on this mountain, and it might all end tonight, in her own doorway, over a decision she'd made, because she couldn't leave a stranger to die in the snow. Would she make the same decision again? If she could go back to that morning at the frosted window, and choose differently. She already knew the answer. That was the terrible part. She already knew. The first blow against the door came sudden, and hard enough to shatter the frame. Maren froze where she stood, halfway between the hearth and the door, heart hammering so loud she could feel it in her throat. A voice followed the blow, a man's voice, sharp, commanding, speaking words she didn't understand, but whose meaning needed no translation at all. Demand. Threat. Both, probably, wrapped together the way anger and fear often are. Behind her, Taji pushed himself up, onto one elbow despite everything, despite the wound, despite her telling him to stay down, and called something back, through the door, weak, breathless, but urgent. A name, maybe. Or an explanation. She had no way to know. The pounding stopped. For one suspended moment, the whole world seemed to hold still. Then came a different sound. A rifle butt, scraping deliberately against the wood. A pause that felt less like hesitation, and more like a held breath, before something worse. She had to decide. Now. Barricade the door, and hope, uselessly, that a plank of pine could stop a dozen armed men, who believed, not, without reason, that she'd done something terrible to one of their own. Or open it herself, and face them, and hope that her own two open hands could say what her mouth couldn't. She laid Josiah's rifle on the table. In plain sight. Out of her own reach, deliberately, a gesture she prayed would be read the way she meant it. Behind her, Taji's hand found her wrist again, weaker this time, but insistent. Washi, he rasped. Then, struggling for something closer to English, or close enough, that she understood it anyway. Good. You. Good. It wasn't much. It was everything she had. She crossed to the door on legs, that felt borrowed, from someone else entirely, lifted the heavy wooden bar, and pulled it open. The sight on the other side stole whatever breath she had left. A wide half-circle of riders faced her cabin, horses stamping and blowing steam, into air gone the color of a fresh bruise, as evening settled, over the snow. Rifles. Bows, strung and ready. Faces painted in stark lines she didn't have the context to read, but understood, on some deep, and ancient level, meant business. At their center, mounted on a lean gray horse, with dark stockinged legs, sat a man, who needed no announcement to be understood, as the one in command. Older than the man on her floor, 30s, maybe closer to 40, hard to say exactly, with a face carved deep by weather, and grief and things she couldn't guess at. A long scar traced down one side of his jaw, pale against sun-darkened skin, pulling the corner of his mouth, into a permanent, grim set. His eyes found hers and held there. Missed nothing. She had the distinct, unsettling sense of being read like a page. He said something. Sharp. A demand, unmistakably, though every word of it meant nothing to her. She started, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. I don't understand. A younger rider near the edge of the group snarled something, and nudged his horse forward, rifle coming up. She flinched. Couldn't help it. The man in the center barked one short word, without even turning his head, and the younger rider stopped dead, expression souring, but obedient. Discipline. Whoever this man was, they obeyed him instantly. Which told her more about him than his scar, or his stillness ever could. He dismounted. Handed his reins off, without looking, and walked toward her, slow, deliberate, moccasins silent on the packed snow. He stopped a few feet off. Close enough that she had to fight the urge to step back. He pointed past her, into the cabin. Then made a gesture, open palm, a question in the shape of a hand. He's asking about Taji, she understood, though she still didn't have the name yet. He's here, she said, and nodded toward the interior. Alive. She didn't know how to say anything more complicated than that, so she stopped there, and let the single word carry whatever weight it could. The man's expression didn't shift. But something in his eyes did. A flicker. Not warmth. Not yet. Something more careful than that, a recalculation. He spoke again, slower this time, and pointed to himself. Kewana. Then to the cabin. A word she'd hear again, and again over the following minutes, until she understood it wasn't a place, or a thing, but a name. My brother, he said, in halting, careful English that cost him something visible to produce. Younger brother. The pieces slid together in her mind all at once, click, 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 like a lock finding its key. Not strangers. Family. This wasn't a war party hunting a stray white woman for sport. This was a brother, searching for his own. Which made everything both simpler, and immeasurably more dangerous, all at the same time. Kewana took a step past her, peering into the dim interior, and his whole posture changed the second he saw the shape on the floor, wrapped in blankets, unmistakably his brother. His eyes narrowed. He looked back at Maren, and this time his expression had hardened again, all the careful neutrality gone, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. He gestured with his chin. A clear command. Step aside. She understood, with total clarity, that this was the moment that decided everything. If he believed she'd harmed his brother, nothing, she said, after this would matter. She'd be dead, before the sun finished setting, and there'd be nobody left to even remember she'd tried to help. She held her ground. Raised both hands, slow, palms open. He was hurt, she said, forcing her voice steady. In the snow. Dying. She pointed to her own side, mimicking the wound's location, as best she could. Arrow. She reached into her apron pocket, with trembling fingers, and drew out the arrowhead, the small, dark, unbarbed piece of stone she'd pulled, from his brother's side, with her own 2 hands 2 days before, and held it out on her open palm. Kewana went very still. He stepped closer. Studied it, turning it slightly, where it sat in her palm, without touching it yet, his expression shifting, from suspicion into something more focused. More analytical. He recognized it. She could see the exact moment he did, some tightening around his eyes, some understanding passing behind them, that had nothing to do with her at all. He took the arrowhead from her hand at last. Turned it over once between his own fingers. And when he looked at her again, the hostility hadn't vanished entirely, but it had shifted. Redirected. No longer aimed quite so squarely at her. He barked a short command over his shoulder. 2 riders dismounted, weapons still ready, and moved past her, into the cabin, with the wary efficiency of men, who expected trouble, and meant to be prepared for it. She stepped back to let them through, heart still hammering, and watched as one knelt beside Taji, pressing a hand to his forehead, then his throat, checking exactly the way she had checked 3 days before in the snow. A low, urgent exchange followed between the kneeling man and Taji. She couldn't follow a word of it. But she watched Taji's face, as he spoke, watched him gesture, weakly, but deliberately, in her direction more than once, and understood he was telling them something. Vouching for her, maybe. or simply telling the truth of what had happened. The warrior who'd checked him looked up, said something to Kawana, tone unmistakably reporting. Kawana's gaze moved, from the warrior, to Taji, to Maren standing frozen in her own doorway, and back to the arrowhead still resting in his palm. Then he did something she hadn't expected at all. He stepped fully inside. The cabin, small as it was, seemed to shrink further around his presence. He knelt beside his brother, and something in his hard face softened by a fraction Maren wouldn't have believed possible a minute earlier, a brother's face, underneath the warrior's, showing itself for just a moment. He spoke to Taji low, gentle, one hand resting briefly on his shoulder. Taji answered, voice weak but coherent now, and at one point lifted a hand, barely, an effort that clearly cost him, and gestured toward Maren again. Kawana listened. Didn't interrupt. When his brother finished, he sat back on his heels, and his eyes drifted, almost as an afterthought, toward the mantle behind Maren's shoulder. And stopped there. She watched his whole body go rigid. He rose, slow, deliberate, and crossed the small room in 3 strides, and picked up the knife she'd set there 3 days, before without a single word of permission asked or given. He turned it, over in his hands the way he'd turned the arrowhead, over, except this time, something in his expression cracked wide open. Recognition, unmistakable, and something underneath it, that looked, unbelievably, almost like grief. He looked at her. Really looked, this time, in a way, that felt like being pinned in place. Where, he said. The single word came out rough, urgent, in careful broken English, that had clearly cost him effort to hold onto through everything else happening around them. Where you get this? My husband, she said, and her own voice came out unsteady now too, because whatever was happening on his face told her this was not a small question. She stopped. Started again. He passed 3 years ago. This knife was his. I don't know where he got it. He never told me. Kawana's jaw worked. He said something low, not to her, almost to himself, in his own language, and it sounded like the kind of thing a man says, when a ghost walks back, into a room he thought was empty. Josiah, he said then, and the name landed in the cabin like something dropped, from a height. Your husband. Josiah Calloway. She felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though nothing in the room had actually moved. Yes, she managed. How do you know that name? Kawana looked down at the knife again. His thumb moved, over the small worn mark at the base of the blade, the same mark Josiah always used to cover, with his own thumb, like he was embarrassed by it, like it was a door he didn't want opened. Because, Kawana said, slow, and each word seemed to weigh something heavy on its way out of him. Because your husband. He saved my life. Long time ago. The silence that followed felt enormous. Larger than the cabin. Larger, almost, than the mountain outside it. And then, he added, and his voice went harder, colder, the warmth of the moment, before draining straight out of it. Then he did something I have not forgiven. She wanted to ask. God, she wanted to ask everything, all at once, 5 years of small unanswered questions about her own husband suddenly rushing up at her like water, through a broken dam. But Kawana had already turned back toward his brother, already begun issuing quiet instructions to the 2 warriors still crouched beside him, and she understood that this conversation, whatever it truly was, wasn't finished. Only paused. The warriors began preparing something. A travois, she realized after a moment, 2 long poles lashed, with hide, meant to carry a wounded man, who couldn't ride. They meant to take him. Of course they did. That had always been the outcome, hadn't it, from the very first moment she'd seen that dark shape at the treeline. She'd known, some part of her had always known, that whatever this was would end, with him going home to his own people. She just hadn't expected it to feel like this. Like something being pulled out of her, the way she'd pulled that arrowhead out of him. Kaywana straightened once his brother had been settled, wrapped now in a heavy buffalo robe brought in by one of the other men, and turned back to her, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not warm. Not hostile either, not anymore. Something in between, something careful and unresolved. He held the small dark knife out to her. Not offering it back exactly, more like he was giving her the chance to decide what it meant now. This, he said, belongs to you now. I think. Not me. She took it, hand still unsteady, and held it like it might burn her. Kaywana, she said, before he could turn away again. What did he do? My husband. What didn't he tell me? Kaywana's face closed over, briefly, some old pain crossing it fast enough, that she almost missed it. He came with men, he said finally. Men who wanted the mountain. Not to live on it. To dig in it. He gestured, a broad sweep of one hand, taking in the whole dark shape of the ridge behind her cabin. Sacred ground. He knew. And still he brought them. She felt something cold settle into her chest, right alongside the grief she'd carried 3 years already, making room for itself beside it. He never told me any of that, she said quietly. I swear to you. I didn't know. Kaywana studied her a long moment. And something in his expression eased, fractionally, like a man deciding, not fully, not yet, but enough for now, that the woman standing in front of him was not the same as the debts owed by the man she'd married. I believe you, he said. And then, quieter, that does not make the debt go away. It was Taji, who spoke next, from where he lay on the travois, voice weak but insistent, dragging his brother's attention back, with an urgency that cut through whatever heaviness had settled over the room. He said something short. Repeated it when Kaywana didn't immediately respond. Chody. There it was again. That same name, the one he'd cried out, through 2 nights of fever, the one Maren had carried in the back of her mind ever since without any way to ask what it meant. Kaywana's whole demeanor shifted instantly. Sharpened. He asked something fast, urgent, and Taji answered in a rush of words that seemed to cost him what little strength he had left. Whatever he said, it hit the room like a struck match. Kaywana turned back to Maren, and this time there was no careful diplomacy left in his face at all. Only naked fear, the kind a man doesn't bother hiding, when there's no time left for pride. My brother, he said. Not this one. Youngest one. Chody. 11 summers. He was with Taji, he went on, words coming faster now, less careful, urgency stripping away the effort of careful English. When the men came. The ones who shot him. They took Chody. Alive. For, he struggled for the word, jaw tight, for money. Ransom. Or worse. The floor tilted again beneath Maren's feet, harder this time. A child. There was a child out there somewhere, in the hands of men who'd left his brother to die slow in a blizzard for the sake of a bounty, and every hour that passed while they stood here talking was an hour that child stayed exactly where he was. Where, she said. Where would they have taken him? Kaywana's eyes met hers, and for the first time, since he'd walked through her door, something passed between them that wasn't suspicion at all. Something closer to a shared, desperate need. I do not know, he admitted. But I know who deals with men like this. Who sells information for money. Who smiles at my people and sells us to men who would kill us just the same. He said a name then. Spoke it like it tasted bad in his mouth. Barnes. Corwin Barnes. Maren went cold all over, a different cold than the mountain had ever given her, because she knew that name. Knew the man. Trader who came, through twice a year, with goods from Tucson, friendly enough, always ready with a joke, and a fair price, a man both settlers and Apache alike had done business with for years, because he seemed, on the surface, to belong to neither side in both. He'd been to her cabin more than once. Sat at her own table. Asked, always so casually, about which trails she used, which parts of the mountain she avoided, which families still lived up in these hills and where. Oh God, she thought, and the thought arrived whole, and terrible and impossible to unthink once it had landed. Oh God. He asked me those same questions. She looked up at Kaywana, and whatever showed on her face must have told him everything he needed to know, because his expression sharpened further, some fragile new understanding passing between the two of them, that had nothing to do with knives or arrowheads, or old debts at all. He's been in my home, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I told him things I didn't know. I didn't know what he was. Kaywana's jaw worked once, hard. Then, he said, low and grim, we have both been fools for the same man. Behind them, on the travois, Taji struggled up, onto one elbow despite the pain of it, despite everything, his eyes fixed on his brother, with a fierce, desperate intensity. Chody, he said again. And this time Maren didn't need the translation at all. Outside, the light was fading fast toward full dark, and somewhere out in that vastness of snow and silence, a boy of 11 summers was still out there, in the hands of men, who had already proven exactly what they were willing to do. Whatever came next, Maren understood, standing there in her own doorway, with her dead husband's knife still clutched in one shaking hand, would not wait for morning. The debt comes due. Night fell fast in the mountains. It always did. 1 minute there was still enough light to see the treeline, the next there was only black, and cold, and the small orange throw of the fire, and everything beyond the door became a place a person had to imagine instead of see. Maren stood in that doorway with her husband's knife still in her hand, and understood, plain as a slap, that there was no morning to wait for. Because a boy was out there. 11 years old. In the hands of men who'd already left one brother to die slow in a blizzard for the sake of a bounty. Which meant every hour spent standing here, talking, grieving, sorting through old betrayals, every one of those hours was an hour Chody didn't have. So. No more standing. Kaywana was already moving, already barking commands to the warriors around him, already a different man than the one who'd stood in her doorway an hour before demanding answers. Urgency did that. Stripped a person down to the actual shape of them. She stepped forward before she'd fully decided to. I'm coming, she said. Kaywana turned. Studied her the way he'd studied the arrowhead. Like he was trying to see all the way, through to what she actually was. No, he said. Flat. Final. You stay. Except that wasn't an answer she had any intention of accepting. Because Barnes had sat at her table. Because Barnes had asked his careful questions, with a smile on his face, while she poured his coffee, and she'd answered every one of them like a fool, like a woman who'd forgotten the first rule the mountain ever taught her, that friendliness up here was sometimes just patience wearing a mask. He knows this cabin, she said. Knows me. If he comes back this way looking for anything, I'm already in it. I'm not staying behind to find out what that means. Kaywana's jaw worked. He looked at his brother, wrapped now on the travois, pale but conscious, watching the exchange, with the particular alertness of a man too weak to move, and too proud to look away, from a fight even, when it wasn't his to have. Taji said something. Short. In their own language, but the tone carried clear enough, not a suggestion. An opinion offered like a fact. Kaywana exhaled through his nose. Something that might have been the ghost of a laugh, if the circumstances had allowed for laughing. He says you are stubborn, Kaywana told her. He says this is why you did not leave him in the snow. Tell him he's not wrong, Maren said. They left 2 men behind, with Taji, and the rest, 9 riders. Maren counted them twice just to be certain her fear wasn't inventing more than there were, moved out, into the dark, with a silence that unsettled her more than any noise could have. She rode behind one of the younger warriors, arms locked around a stranger's waist, snow spraying off the horse's hooves, cold biting straight through every layer she owned. She'd thought, foolishly, that fear this large would be loud in her chest. It wasn't. It had gone quiet instead. Focused. The kind of fear that clears a mind out rather than flooding it. Kawana rode alongside her for a stretch, close enough to talk over the wind, if either of them had wanted to. Neither did, for a while. Then, finally, he spoke, voice pitched low. "Barnes has a camp," he said. "South. Near the old mining claim. He trades there sometimes. Whiskey. Guns. Information. He sells to whoever pays." "He sold you," Maren said. "And he sold me." Same man. Two different lies. Kawana's scarred jaw tightened. "I trusted him 5 years," he said. "Since before your husband came to these mountains. He and I found the boundary together, once. Your husband and I. Before he brought the surveyors up. We stood on that ridge and I believed him a man of his word." She turned that over, the weight of it settling slow. So it hadn't only been an old wound, then. It had been a friendship first, or something close to one, before it curdled into whatever this was. "What happened?" she asked. "Between you?" Kawana was quiet a long stretch of trail, hooves crunching, breath fogging thick around them both. "He led men to the ridge above the spring," he finally said. "Surveyors. For a mining company out of Tucson. Told them the ground was empty. Told them no one would object. He was wrong to do it, and worse, he knew he was wrong the whole time he was doing it. That is the part one could not forgive at first." "At first," Maren repeated. "Which meant something changed." "I went to him myself," Kawana said. "Told him what that ground meant to my people." He listened. Something in his face, when he listened, I had not expected, that from a man already halfway through selling us out. He went back to the company. Refused the survey. Returned every dollar they had paid him. Never went near that ridge again, as long as he lived. Something in Maren's chest loosened at that, and tightened again in almost the same breath, grief and relief tangled too close together to fully separate. "He never told me a word of it," she said softly. "Not the wrong. Not the making right. Some men," Kawana said, "carry shame quieter than they carry pride." She thought of the knife on the mantel, of Josiah's thumb always covering, that small worn mark like a door he didn't want opened, and understood, with a kind of aching clarity, that she'd been married 5 years to a man, who apparently preferred to be forgiven in silence rather than praised out loud. "That sounds like him exactly," she said. They smelled the camp before they saw it. Wood smoke, and under it, something sharper, whiskey, and gun oil, and the particular smell of men, who hadn't washed in a good while and didn't much care. Kawana raised a fist. The column behind them stopped, as one, horses shifting uneasily in the dark, breath fogging thick in the cold. He gestured Maren down off the horse, and 2 warriors slipped forward on foot, low, fast, gone into the treeline, before she'd finished getting her feet under her properly. They came back within minutes. Reported low and quick. Kawana's expression didn't change while he listened. That worried her more than if it had. "For men," he told her finally. "A fire. And a boy tied near it." Her breath caught. "Alive." "Alive," Kawana confirmed. "For now." There it was again. That same phrase she'd used herself, 5 nights ago, standing over a dying stranger in her own cabin. For now. It had followed her the whole way, through this, hadn't it? Every safety she'd managed to buy anyone, since that first morning at the frosted window had only ever come, with that same terrible asterisk attached. "Silas Cobb," she said. "He's there. Kawana nodded once. Then let's go get that boy back, she said, and was faintly surprised by how steady her own voice came out, given how little of her actually felt steady at all. They moved through the trees in a loose crescent, quiet as the snow allowed, which wasn't quiet at all, not really, every footstep a small crunching betrayal underfoot. Maren stayed low, Josiah's rifle heavy, and cold in her hands, heart going so hard she could feel it in her ears. She caught her first sight of the camp, through a gap in the pines. A fire, small and mean, throwing orange light across 4 men huddled near it. And off to one side, half in shadow, a small shape sitting hunched against a tree trunk, wrists bound in front of him. Chody. Even from this distance she could see he was shivering. Even from this distance she could see he was, God help her, still just a child, 11 years old, and trying very hard not to look, as frightened as he plainly was. Something in her went sharp, and clear and furious all at once. One of the men near the fire stood, stretched, and she got her first proper look at him. Broad through the shoulders. A dark, matted beard. A rifle slung loose, and easy across his back, the way a man carries a weapon, when he's long, since stopped worrying about needing it fast. Silas Cobb. Had to be. He said something to the boy, low, and laughed at whatever answer he got, or didn't get, and the casual cruelty in that single sound made Maren's finger find the trigger guard of the rifle, without her quite deciding to put it there. Beside her, Kawana went rigid too. She could feel it radiating off him, that particular stillness a man gets right, before violence, coiled and precise. Not yet, he breathed, so low it barely qualified, as sound at all. We wait for the signal. Wait for what signal, she started to ask. And then, from the far side of the camp, a low owl call drifted out across the snow, one of Kawana's men, already in position, telling the rest they were ready. Kawana raised his hand. Held it a beat. Then brought it down. Everything happened at once, the way violence always does, no matter how much planning goes into it beforehand. One moment there was only firelight and quiet menace. The next, warriors were breaking, from the treeline on 3 sides at once, and Cobb's men were scrambling up, with weapons half raised, shouting, and the whole camp dissolved, into chaos and gun smoke, and the ugly bright cracks of rifle fire tearing the cold air apart. Maren dropped behind a fallen log on instinct, heart slamming, and forced herself to look for one thing only. The boy. Where was the boy? There. Still against the tree, still bound, and one of Cobb's men, the lean one, the shifty-eyed one, was hauling him up by the collar, dragging him back away, from the fighting, rifle in his other hand, using the child, as cover the way a coward uses anything he can reach. Something in Maren went past fear entirely, and out the other side, into something colder. She was moving, before she'd finished thinking it through. Around the log, low, cutting through the trees at an angle, that would put her between the man, and the deeper dark of the forest he was dragging Chody toward. He didn't see her, until she was almost on him. Let him go, she said, rifle up, both hands steady in a way that surprised even her. The man's eyes went wide, then narrow, calculating fast the way men like that always did. That's a fine rifle for a lady, who don't look like she's used one much, he said. I've used it plenty, she said. Test me. He hesitated. Half a second, maybe less. Long enough for Chody, small, scared, but not stupid, not passive, to twist hard against the grip on his collar, and drive an elbow back, into the man's stomach, with everything an 11-year-old had in him. It was enough. The man's grip loosened, just barely, just long enough. Maren didn't think. She fired. The shot took him in the shoulder, spun him half around, and he went down cursing, into the snow, rifle skittering off, into the dark. Chody scrambled free, and looked up at her, wide-eyed, breath coming in short frightened bursts. She crossed to him in 3 strides, cut the bindings at his wrists, with Josiah's knife, the same knife, she registered distantly, that had started this whole impossible chain of events, and pulled him behind the nearest tree just, as another burst of gunfire tore through the camp behind them. "You're safe," she told him, though she had no earthly way of promising that yet. "Stay down. Stay with me." He didn't understand the words, probably. But he understood the tone, the same way Taji had understood it 5 nights before, and he pressed close against her side, and stayed exactly where she put him. The fighting didn't last long. It never does, not really, not the actual violent part of it, it's the after that stretches on forever in memory, even when the thing itself is over in minutes. 2 of Cobb's men went down fast, caught in the first volley, from the treeline. A third, the one Maren had shot, sat groaning in the snow, more furious than dying, disarmed and surrounded, before he could do anything about either. Which left Cobb himself. She saw him, through the smoke and firelight, backed against a boulder, rifle up, eyes wild in a way that told her plainly he understood exactly how this was going to end, and had decided to make it cost as much as he could manage on the way there. Kaywana advanced on him steady, unhurried, rifle level. "It's over, Cobb," Kaywana said. Flat. No heat in it at all, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. Cobb barked out a laugh that didn't have any real humor in it. "You think this ends with me," he said. "You think I'm the one paying for this?" He gestured wide, taking in the camp, the fire, the whole bloody mess of it. "I'm hired help," he spat. "Somebody's paying me good money to clear Apache off this mountain quiet like. You kill me, there's another one behind me by spring. And another behind him." Maren felt something cold slide down her spine at that. Not the threat of it, the shape of it. This wasn't one greedy man working alone. This was bigger. Organized. "Who?" she said, stepping forward despite every instinct telling her to stay back, with the boy. "Who's paying you?" Cobb's eyes cut to her, and something ugly moved behind them. "Well now," he said. "If it ain't the widow Calloway. Barnes told me about you. Said you were an easy mark. Guess he wasn't wrong." "Who's paying you?" she said again, harder this time. Cobb grinned, blood on his teeth, from a split lip he'd earned somewhere in the scuffle. "Man doesn't give his name to hired help," he said. "But I'll tell you this much, free of charge. He wears a uniform. Fort Bowie. And he's got investors back east lining up to buy this whole mountain range the second it's cleared of every last Apache breathing on it." The silence that followed felt like a held breath across the whole camp. "An officer," Kaywana said, voice gone very quiet, and very dangerous. "From the fort." "Didn't say that," Cobb said, grin widening even, through the pain plainly written across his face. "Said uniform. Coulda meant a lot of things." Kaywana's finger tightened on the trigger. "Kaywana," Maren said, quick, sharp. "If he dies, whoever's behind this stays hidden. We need him alive. We need proof." Kaywana's jaw worked, hard, some furious calculation happening behind his eyes. Then, slowly, the rifle came down, just slightly. "You're right," he said. "Alive is more useful." Cobb's grin faltered for the first time. Wasn't expecting that, was he, Maren thought. Wasn't expecting mercy to be a strategy rather than a weakness. They found Barnes at the edge of camp trying to slip away, into the trees on foot, having apparently decided somewhere in the middle of the gunfire, that loyalty to any side wasn't worth dying for. One of Kaywana's warriors dragged him back, into the firelight by the collar, and Maren felt something hot and furious rise up in her chest at the sight of him, this man who'd sat at her table, eaten her food, asked his careful friendly questions, with a smile, that she'd trusted, without a second thought. "You," she said. Just that. One word, and it carried 5 days of betrayal in it. Barnes held his hands up, palms out, that same easy smile trying, and failing to reassert itself across his face. "Now Mrs. Calloway," he started. "Don't," she said. "Don't you dare." "I never meant for anybody to get hurt," he said. "I just trade information. That's all it ever was. A man's got to make a living out here same as anybody." Kawana crossed to him slow, and the temperature in the small clearing seemed to drop several more degrees. "You sold my brother's movements," he said. "To men who left him to die in the snow." "I didn't know what they'd do with it," Barnes said, and even Maren could hear how thin that sounded, even to him. "You knew exactly what they'd do with it," Maren said. "You've known for years. That's why you're so careful never to pick a side. Because you were never on a side. You were only ever on your own." Barnes's easy expression finally cracked, just slightly, something more desperate showing through underneath. "There's more of them," he said suddenly, words tumbling out fast now, the calculation of a man trying to trade information one last time for his own skin. "The officer Cobb mentioned. I know who he is. I can tell you." Kawana's eyes narrowed. "Talk," he said. Barnes talked. What came out of him, over the next several minutes, standing there in the firelight, with a rifle at his back, and every reason in the world to finally tell the truth, painted a picture uglier than Maren had let herself imagine even at her most frightened. "A lieutenant out of Fort Bowie," Barnes gave a name, careful, precise, the name of a man, who signed supply requisitions, and filed patrol reports, and had, apparently, spent the last 2 years quietly funneling both information and money toward men like Cobb, men willing to do violence the army itself couldn't be seen doing openly. The goal was simple, in the ugly way that greed always simplifies things. Clear the mountain range of resistance. Make the land safe, on paper, for a mining syndicate already quietly buying up claims sight unseen based on assurances that the Apache presence here would soon be, in the lieutenant's own words according to Barnes, resolved. Resolved. Maren turned the word over in her mind, and felt sick at the clean, bureaucratic ugliness of it. A word a man could write in a report, and never once picture what it actually meant on the ground. A boy tied to a tree in the snow. A young man shot and left to freeze. A whole silent campaign of small, deniable cruelties, adding up to something enormous. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, unwittingly, stood a woman who'd been feeding this very man biscuits and coffee at her own table for years. "There's a ledger," Barnes said, voice quick now, eager to keep talking, as long as talking kept him breathing. "I've been keeping it myself, years now. Payments, dates, names. The syndicate paid, through me sometimes, when they didn't want it traced back to the fort. Cobb's got the newer pages in his saddlebag. Proof of all of it, if you know where to look." "Where?" Kawana said. Barnes's eyes flicked, unwilling, toward Cobb, still sitting bound, and bleeding by the fire. "His saddlebag," Barnes said. "He never lets it out of arm's reach." They found it exactly where Barnes said it would be. A worn leather ledger, water-stained at the corners, filled with cramped handwriting, that documented, in cold and careful detail, exactly the kind of arithmetic that turns human lives into line items. Dates. Amounts paid. Brief, clinical notations that made Maren's stomach turn every time her eyes caught one. And there, near the back, tucked among older entries, that must have passed through Barnes's hands long before Cobb ever carried the book, a name she recognized, with a jolt that went through her whole body. J. Calloway, Survey, Ridge Access, paid in full. Josiah. She stood very still, staring at those 4 words in a stranger's cramped handwriting, and felt the ground shift under her feet all over again. Below it, in the same hand, a second line, added later. Survey voided. Access refused. Calloway returned payment in full. No further cooperation. There it was, then. Written down in a dead man's own accounting, the exact shape of the story Kaywana had already told her on the ride down, through the dark. Not a new wound. Just the old one, confirmed in ink. "I'm sorry," she said, quiet, to no one in particular, to the memory of a husband who'd carried this quietly for the rest of his life rather than ever once explaining himself. "I'm sorry, I didn't know to ask." There was a second document tucked behind the ledger's back pages, folded small, edges soft with handling. Maren drew it out carefully, and unfolded it by the firelight. A boundary agreement. Handwritten, but formal, signed at the bottom by two names, Josiah's, and beneath it, in different, more deliberate lettering, a mark she recognized instantly, from the pattern Kaywana had described earlier that night. She held it out to him. "This is yours," she said. "I think. Not mine." Kaywana took it, and his hands, she noticed, weren't quite steady either, as he unfolded it fully and read. His expression, reading it, did something complicated. Something that moved, through anger and grief, and finally settled, unexpectedly, on something gentler. "He kept his word," Kaywana said quietly. "In the end. That is not nothing, Mrs. Calloway." "No," she agreed, throat tight. "It's not nothing at all." Dawn was still hours off, when they started back, Cobb bound and slung, over a horse, Barnes similarly secured, the ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and tucked inside Kaywana's coat like something precious enough to guard, with his own body. Chody rode with his brother now, small arms locked tight around Kaywana's waist, exhaustion and relief written plain across a face too young to have carried what it had carried these past days. Maren rode near the back of the column, Josiah's knife back in her own coat pocket, where it belonged, and let herself, finally, feel the full weight of everything that had happened settle down onto her shoulders all at once. The exhaustion. The grief, old and new both, tangled together now in ways she suspected would take years to fully untangle. And underneath all of it, something else. Something that surprised her by how strong it was. Something like pride. She hadn't bolted the door. Hadn't stayed safe, and small and separate the way 5 careful years alone on that mountain had trained her to be. She'd chosen, instead, over and over, at every single fork this whole impossible week had offered her, to reach toward the harder, more dangerous, more human thing. Josiah would have understood that, she thought. Would have been glad of it, probably, even proud, in whatever quiet way he'd always shown pride in things. Ahead of her, Taji rode slow, and careful on a gentle mare, wound bound tight, color coming back properly, into his face for the first time, since she'd found him. He caught her eye once, across the column, and offered the smallest of nods. Not gratitude exactly. Something closer to acknowledgement. One survivor to another. She nodded back. They reached her cabin an hour before sunrise, the eastern sky just beginning to gray at its lowest edge, and the whole strange procession came to a halt in the yard she'd walked alone in for 3 long years. Kaywana dismounted first, lifted Chody down carefully, then turned to help his brother off the mare, with a gentleness that made something in Maren's chest go soft and aching all over again. He crossed to her, while the others began setting up a temporary camp, tending to Cobb and Barnes, building a fire against the last of the cold. "We will take these 2 to the fort ourselves," he told her, meaning Cobb and Barnes both. "There is an agent there, who is not corrupt. Not all of them are. This one will listen, with proof like this in hand. The lieutenant will answer for it. One way or another. This I promise you." She believed him. Something about the flat certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. He reached into his coat then, and drew out the boundary agreement, Josiah's careful handwriting still visible in the growing light, and held it out to her. "Keep this," he said. "It belongs to your family. As much as it belongs to mine." She took it, folded it with careful hands, and held it against her chest a moment. Thank you, she said. For believing me. When you had every reason not to. Kawana studied her a long moment, morning light slowly gathering strength around them both, painting the snow gold at its edges. Your husband made one mistake, he said, and corrected it, quietly, for the rest of his life. You made no mistake at all. You saw a dying man, and you helped him. Simple as that. Some debts, Mrs. Calloway, are paid the moment they are owed. Yours was paid the night you pulled my brother out of the snow. Something in her throat closed up too tight to answer right away. Behind Kawana, Taji had settled near the fire, Chody curled close against his side, the boy finally, visibly, allowing himself to be simply a tired child again now that the danger had passed. Taji caught Maren's eye, and said something, slow, careful, clearly practicing words he didn't have much confidence in yet. Thank you, he said. In English. Plain and simple and entirely his own effort. You're welcome, she said, and meant it more fully than those two small words could really carry. She laughed, surprised by it, the sound coming out rough, after everything the night had put her through. I was terrified the whole time, she admitted, knowing he probably wouldn't catch half of it, not minding. He smiled at that. First real smile she'd seen, from him, and it changed his whole face, made him look, suddenly, exactly as young, as he actually was. They stayed 3 more days, camped in her yard, and just inside her treeline, while Taji's strength returned properly, and word was sent ahead to the fort about what was coming and why. Maren found herself, in that strange suspended stretch of days, doing something she hadn't done in 3 long years. She wasn't alone. Chody took to following her around the cabin, with the boundless curiosity of an 11-year-old finally allowed to simply be a child again, asking Kawana to translate a dozen questions an hour, about the chickens, about the stove, about the strange framed photograph of a serious-looking man, that sat on her mantel. Your husband, Kawana translated. Yes, Maren said. Josiah. Chody studied the photograph a long moment, small face serious, and said something quiet. He looks kind, Kawana translated. He was, Maren said. Complicated. But kind. Taji healed steadily, color and strength returning day by day, until by the 3rd morning he was up, and moving carefully around the yard, insisting, over his brother's clear objections, on helping split kindling one-handed for her woodpile. You don't have to do that, she told him, more than once. He ignored her, more than once, in exactly the stubborn way she suspected she'd have ignored the same advice herself. They left at first light 3 days later, the whole procession moving out, through trees just beginning to shed the last of the storm's snow, sunlight breaking clean, and bright through branches overhead for the first time in what felt like a very long while. Chody hugged her, before he left, quick, fierce, the unself-conscious embrace of a child who'd decided, somewhere in 3 days of chicken feeding, and kindling splitting, that this strange quiet woman belonged to his story now too. Taji lingered a moment longer than the others, standing in her yard, with the morning light behind him, looking, for just a second, less like the barely breathing shape she'd dragged 50 agonizing yards, through snow and more like exactly what he was, a young man, with his whole life still ahead of him, alive to live it, because a stranger had refused to bolt her door. He touched 2 fingers to his own chest, then extended his hand toward her, palm open. Friend, he said. Careful. Certain. Friend, she agreed, and meant it, with her whole battered, grieving, unexpectedly fuller heart. Kawana mounted last, and paused a moment, before turning his horse toward the trail. We will return, he told her. Not as strangers. As neighbors. And when the ground softens in spring, there is a place near the spring, where wildflowers grow thick, before anywhere else on the mountain does. My brother tells me you have never seen it. I'd like to, she said. Then it is settled, he said, and something in his scarred, weathered face came, as close to a smile, as she suspected it ever did. She stood in her yard a long, while after they'd gone, watching the empty trail, where they'd disappeared, into the trees, listening to a silence that had, somehow, entirely changed its character, since the last time she'd stood in this exact spot alone. It wasn't the silence of isolation anymore. It was the silence of a held breath finally let go. She thought of the woman she'd been 5 days ago, scraping frost off a window, telling herself, firmly, that whatever dark shape lay at the treeline was none of her business, was not her trouble, was something a sensible woman bolted her door against. She was glad, fiercely and completely glad, that some stubborn part of her had refused to listen. Because Josiah's voice had been right, all those years ago, and it was right still. Every soul was worth saving, if a person had the means. And it turned out, she'd learned this snow-heavy week, that she'd had more means than she ever gave herself credit for. Not just a rifle, not just a knife, not just a cabin, with wood stacked to the rafters. She'd had, all along, the harder thing. The willingness to open a door she had every good reason to keep shut. She turned, finally, and walked back inside, where the fire still burned warm against the last of winter's chill, and found herself, for the first time in 3 long years, already looking forward to spring.